Good evening. Welcome to Spacemen Pod. My name's Ian Edmond. I've got a Spacemen 3 website at spacemen3.co.uk. And my friend Mark.
I am Mark Lascelles. I've been a Spaceman 3 fan for well over 30 years, and I used to run Runcible Records, which sold rare music and specialised in Spaceman 3.
And we're going to talk a little more about what we're planning to do with the podcast and why we're bothering with any of this shortly. But I thought we could start off by just talking about how we discovered Spacemen 3. For me, I was a bit of a latecomer, really. It wasn't until the end of 1992 that I remember my wife and I looking through the NME's end of year poll, and out of all the albums that we thought we'd be interested in, Laser Guided Melodies was the only one that I noticed. So I thought, yeah, I probably would be interested in that, but I don't really know anything about it. It was my birthday in February, and so it arrived as a birthday present shortly afterwards. And very quickly, I realized that this was something that I needed to check out in a bit more detail. So, thankfully, fairly early on in the days of Spiritualized, there wasn't a huge amount to track down. Although, having said that, even by that point, it was getting hard enough to find the first single. That was already collector's prices there, but got them in and was really excited and interested. I don't know if anyone remembers the chart show that was on ITV at Saturday lunchtimes. Around that time, I mean, there was, I think I did remember seeing Spiritualized video on there, but then also there was a Spectrum video. They played a bit of the video for How You Satisfy Me. And now I was completely ignorant still at this point, knew nothing about it, but thought, oh, that sounds a bit like Spiritualized. I think I'll like that as well. Maybe I could buy that EP to sort of check them out too. And again, thought that was great. But it wasn't until a bit later when I was with some friends doing some shopping in London, where there was a very strange, like a very temporary record shop by Tottenham Court Road Tube. It was quite near to the Astoria. Of course, anyone who knows that part of London will know that the Astoria and all of that area has now been redeveloped as part of Crossrail, so not there anymore. It's a bit sad. I used to love the Astoria. I mean, it was a complete dive, but I really loved it.
Hanway Street, I'm guessing.
Yeah, I think
that was the little street behind with a couple of collectors' record shops.
Oh, was that the one behind what was the Virgin Megastore?
Somewhere there, yeah.
Yeah, no, they were the proper ones, but this was a bit more like, it was just upstairs above a regular shop, and it seemed to be like the CDs had been imported ones that needed to be got rid of. They all had very strange, big, chunky security tags on them, the sort of things that will set off an alarm when you walk out the shop with the old sort of metal patterns on them, and they had copies of Recurring, and they had loads of them, huge numbers of them. And it wasn't the Fire Recurring, it was the dedicated one that wasn't really a UK thing, it was more of a European thing. So I think these were largely imports.
Not easy to find those now.
Well, yeah, I was very lucky, and for you, I mean, that was my version of Recurring for a while. So I think that was probably my first realization that these two bands that I now just recently liked had come from the same place. And I know lots of people will probably not have Recurring down as their typical Spacemen 3 album, and in many people's cases not their favorite because it diverged a bit from the earlier sound, but I didn't have that context to go on. I just thought it was fantastic. And
it is fantastic.
Obviously very much an album of two halves, but that didn't seem to be a problem at all, and there was so much to love on both sides. So that was it, really. Just carried on investigating backwards. And I remember at the time being not tremendously well off, so I couldn't afford to go out. I mean, there's only 3 or 4 albums to get, but I couldn't rush out and buy them. And I remember going through a period of weeks of just studying them in record shops and thinking these enticing titles, and oh, look, on that album suddenly they're crediting themselves separately. So I had all this history waiting to be accessed that I couldn't quite get at, and slowly, bit by bit, I was able to get them. And yeah, well, never look back. It was just a complete turnaround. And then, of course, I eventually put the pieces together and realized that I had seen Spacemen.
You had, in fact, seen them live.
Yeah,
their last performance.
Indeed, I went to that Reading Festival and had no idea who they were, and they were playing when I got into the venue. And I just thought, oh my god, this is just they're just playing the same chord again and again, and this is very interesting. And we've had to queue up for an hour to get in, and it's raining. And was this all a massive mistake? And yeah, oh well, there you go. Can't go back and change anything now.
That's the way it works sometimes.
Mike, you've got a bit more history than I.
Well, I was fortunate in that I did see the Spacemen, saw them live 5 times, starting in May '88. But the first time I'd ever heard of them was would have been sometime in 1987, and I was hanging around with a guy called Phil. I've sadly lost touch with, but he was an incredible musical influencer. He got me into all kinds of psychedelic music, and one day he was grumbling that he'd damaged the hearing in one of his ears, and I asked him what had happened, and he sort of looked sheepish and said, "Oh, it's a Spacemen 3 gig." And I looked at him, I'd never heard of this band. I had visions of kind of monstrous great synthesizers and deafening noise and everything else, and I was interested, and I asked him what they sounded like, and he came back with a quote I'll never forget. He thought for a moment, he said, "Spacemen 3 sound like a Hawkwind record that's got stuck." And I was a big Hawkwind fan at that time, and so obviously my interest was peaked, and I bought Walking with Jesus and played it, which I thought it sounded pretty good. I did struggle with the enormous version of Roller Coaster on the other side, which does go on for a long time with a lot of it on one note and everything, and it really confused me. But suddenly, out of this chaos comes the tranquility of Feel So Good, which I'll never forget it. It was like one of those, like the curtains opening and the sun coming. It was an amazing moment, and as a result, that's sort of my favorite Spacemen 3 song. It's certainly the one that got me into it. And at that time, I was I was seeing a lot of bands, and saw them a few times. Blew me away every time. I then went away to Australia, still kind of kept in touch with the music. When I came back, I started Runcible Records. Because I was such a fan, we started to specialize a little bit. I approached Pete Kember, Sonic Boom, at a Spectrum gig in about late '92, and started trading stuff with him for something which has gone on to this day. Actually, still very much in touch with him. The great thing was, because I was such a collector, in that he basically sold us every rare thing that he had, and anything that I didn't have, I kept. So my collection just kind of exploded and continues to do so. Although there's not a lot of things left out there, I don't think, but I still keep my eye out. But that's about it. But my enthusiasm is still as it was. And I still keep collecting and still keep playing the music.
Well, I think it's pretty unlikely that there'll be many people listening in who are not already the Spacemen 3 enthusiasts. But since this is our first episode, let's just do a quick overview. Spacemen 3 formed in the early 1980s. Exact timings are a little obscure in those days. We're trying to rely on people who weren't expecting to have to keep their history perfectly transcribed, and things are a little fuzzy. But sometimes in the early 80s, certainly by early 1983, there were a few gigs going on. Formed by Sonic Boom, the stage name of Pete Kember, and Jason Pierce, who of course has now gone on to be the famous one, if you like. Original drummer Tim Morris, who was apparently a good person to have in your band, and he was in quite a few local rugby bands because his bedroom was ideal for band practices, and bassist Pete Bain. Pete and Tim left after a little while because Jason had gone to art college in Mason. There didn't seem to be an awful lot going on, but Jason would come back occasionally, and they recruited Natty Brooker as a drummer. Still no bass though, and they played for a while just as a 3-piece with no bass, which made them very unusual. Anyway, let's face it, but on the local scene that really stood out.
Their influence of the Cramps is worth mentioning there, which originally the Cramps, of course, had no bass player when they started.
Absolutely, yes. The band that Tim and Pete had gone off to join, The Push, broke up, and Pete Bain rejoined, so Space went back to a 4-piece. And it was this lineup that recorded their first album, Sound of Confusion, and carried on touring in the local area. After a while, Natty left, and they recruited a new drummer, Sterling Roscoe. And things continued locally, occasional gigs in London. They recorded their second album, Perfect Prescription, viewed by many people, I imagine both of us, to be their real highlight. Toured extensively in Europe, especially in 1988. We'll be back to more of that later. After that tour, Roscoe left, and Pete Bain left a little bit after that as well. So there's very much a half-time break in the story at this point. Bit of regrouping, recruited new bass player Will Carruthers and drummer Johnny Mattock. Recorded the album Playing with Fire, many people's favourite. Although I have a strange blind spot with Playing with Fire, but that's one for a future conversation, I'm sure.
There's no Johnny Mattock on that album, of course.
Indeed,
it's all a drum machine.
Right, indeed. It's almost entirely a drum machine. I can't believe it's a drum machine tapping those cymbals at the beginning.
It does find amazing.
But there we go. More tours, bigger UK ones. Playing with Fire was a big breakthrough. It got a lot of attention in the UK music press, and they were suddenly elevated to be being a big player in that alternative NME melody maker sounds kind of scene. Carried on to big European and UK tours in 1989. But things had started to fall apart a little bit. The relationships within the band weren't what they had been. People started recording a little more individually. I mean, the credits on Playing with Fire bear that out. And over the course of 1990, things sort of really fell apart. But there was another album, largely recorded, finished off and finally released in early 1991, Recurring, which is like an excellent full stop to that whole era, really. And although we have Jason going on to do his work in Spiritualized, still going on to this day, long career there, and the most recent albums is fantastic. One of the best ones he's done, I think. And Pete Kember going on to do various projects, Spectrum being his main band, and then a lot of work with experimental audio research, which, as its name suggests, is a lot more experimental, bit of an acquired taste. Not everyone's going to be that sympathetic to that. It's not really song-based stuff. And more recently, he's returned to the Sonic Boom name to do another electronic album, but a bit more song-based one, and that's been extremely well received as well. So I think we hit an era at the moment where, well, from my point of view, I think both of them are on a bit of a high, really. Makes it sound like I think there's been a problem in the past, but I think the current output is amongst some of the best solo stuff they've done for a long time.
I would agree, yeah.
Yeah. So why have we bothered to do this sort of thing? Well, as Mark was saying with his summary of what it was like to get into them for himself, it's not the sort of enthusiasm that's really gone away. Well, indeed, stealing from one of Jason's lines, which I've always used as the hook line for my website, I have a passion, sweet Lord, and it just won't go away. I don't know what quite it is about Spacemen 3, because let's face it, musically, a lot of it is pretty primitive. It's not like it's full of complete finesse and musical showing off and things like that. But I think there is something about it that for the people who it does click with, it just gets you on such a deep and fundamental level that it's something you don't want to keep to yourself. It's the sort of thing that you want to share with other people. And I think that, Mark's had a lot of interesting stuff with the record dealing over the years and all the concerts that we've been to and so on. I think we've got a few things that we can talk about that I hope people will enjoy. And also I hope that people listening will chip in and give their contributions and suggestions for what we could talk about. And, we'd love any contributions that people can have, really.
Yeah, so, absolutely.
That's the idea of it. Now, I think it's worth saying that for people who know Spacemen 3 a bit, but who are not quite the sad cases that we are with all of the detail, what they probably know about Spacemen 3, if you boil it down to two things, is they took a lot of drugs and they argued a lot and they ended up hating each other. And both of those things are true. There's no doubt about it. But it's the emphasis that has been put on all those things, as opposed to the music, that we really love, which I think we'd like to try and do a little bit if we can to try and rebalance a bit.
I
mean,
think that's a good move.
yeah, it's not like we're never going to talk about drugs. It's so central to some of the stories that it's impossible to avoid it, and it's impossible to avoid the fact that there were some conflicts from time to time. But that's just a little part of it, really. There is so much more to it, and in particular, it's the feelings that just get evoked by some of the music, and we just like to try and be a bit more positive than the usual spin that's put on Spacemen 3 here, and celebrate what it is that we love about them.
That's it. If the music wasn't any good, we wouldn't be talking about it now. I don't think you could really get a lot of mileage out of those two factors, which is what people tend to remember about the band, when there's actually a great deal more. So,
well, in that respect then, Mark, how could you try your best to sum up what it is about Spacemen 3?
I think that there's a lot of the attitude of the guys who made the music comes through the music itself. I think that there was a certain lack of caring really what the press thought about them, what pretty much anybody else thought about them. They had their own singular vision, and indeed some of the reviews that came out back then were beyond negative. They were, I mean, personally insulting to the mental health of the musicians responsible in some cases. But for me back then, I felt that watching them on stage, they seemed to be pretty much the same individuals as the guys in the audience. And so in that way, there was a real connection, just in terms of these were guys who got up on stage without putting on any fancy clothes. There was, if you call just having a bank of projector lights a stage show, it was just light shining, but they didn't do anything flashy. I mean, two of them sat down the first time I saw them, which I'd never seen musicians sit down on the stage before. And there was just something that, I don't know, the noise that came out of those speakers just completely enveloped you. They were also extremely loud, which has to be used carefully, because I've seen bands try and produce a barrage of noise and fail spectacularly. But every time I saw Spacemen 3, they just got it right. They're also the only band I know who can leave the stage for half an hour and drench feedback, and the audience will still stay standing there hoping for one last morsel of music. That I've never seen before. And quite often they wouldn't come back, so you would just be left standing there. But I think it's that, not just the sound of the music, but the fact that you seem to be able to hear the personalities of the people who made it come through, both in the noisy music and the quiet music, of which there was a great deal of contrast. I've played people's Spacemen 3 albums with a lot of the laid back stuff, and they've sort of blissed out, think it's the most wonderful thing ever. But you play them a blast of Starship or OD Catastrophe from one of the early gigs, and you can clear a room playing that sort of stuff to the wrong people. So but for me, it just completely connected, and I've not been able to shake it off. And that's kind of it. It is kind of hard to describe. As you say, the music is quite primitive. There are moments of almost ugliness when you take a track like Things Will Never Be the Same, which I was used to, my group of friends used to refer to it as the mangled monster, which is actually, it's almost unpleasant, yet it veers into a sort of area of beauty, which is really hard to describe with all its shrieks and squalls and everything else. But I think that kind of epitomizes for me how they are able to make that actually quite challenging music listenable. Is about the best word I can come from. It's enveloping.
That's really interesting that almost everything that you have said about what they did to appeal to you was based around the live experience, which I guess shows quite how intense it was. And it'll be interesting if hopefully we can hear from people who were there at the time as to how much that tallies with what they remember as well. Because of course I don't have any of that, not having properly seen them live. And so for me, it all comes through enjoying the records. And yeah, it's interesting again what you say about, because the perception, if you just ask what does Spacemen 3 sound like, again, to someone who's not as all enveloped as we are, they'll probably describe that live experience, something very loud and repetitive. And great though that is, it's not there on that much of the records. Okay, first album, it's completely like that. fair enough, and little bits from there on in. But most of the stuff is actually fairly serene. It's the mixture of those things that definitely brought it in for me. If I were to try to try to sum up the things that make the music so appealing, well, there's a whole cast of people involved, and they've all got their own great points that I'm sure we'll talk about in the future. But fundamentally, it's Jason Pierce and Pete Kember. We can't avoid that. They were the ones who were writing the music, and I think the mixture of Jason's musicality, of his ability to, I think Pete Kember once said, he could just pick up any stringed instrument and play it straight away, and his playing is exquisite there. His composition, because he's responsible, I think, for most of the song-based stuff of the early times in particular. And his lyrics, which might be incredibly basic at times, but he seems to know how to use the fewest words to get across the deepest feelings, really precisely. So that's the one side of it. But that on its own wouldn't quite do it if it's not mixed with Pete Kember's attitude. Now he has said on many occasions he's not a musician, he can barely play. So it's not to do with the fact that he's some virtuoso guitarist. But if he wasn't there, for example, Jason, who primarily wrote something like Walking with Jesus, if Pete Kember wasn't there to say, and this bit, we just hold that repetitive note for about as long as you think you should hold it for, and then twice as long as that, that wouldn't really have happened. And so when you listen to things on the album version of Walking with Jesus, the gap between the sound of confusion, pause, instrumental break, the sound of love, it's the same phrase, but that chunk in the middle is just, almost everyone would say that's too long, but it's just right. And the same with on the same album, in the first track on Take Me to the Other Side, the pauses between the verses.
They're perfect.
Yeah, I know. And again, it's the same thing, especially the first one. The first one's the best one because it doesn't have as much variety and it gets into the trance-like side of it. And it's the same sort of thing. You do that pause for about as long as you should, and then you do it for about that long again, and then a little bit more, and then you come back. And it's the combination. I think I rather pretentiously would call it the Kember audacity, because it's the audacity to say, no, we're going to just carry on a bit longer on this. And it just works. It's like, it reminds me of things like of Warhol's art. People, the people who look at Warhol, it's a very common thing for people to say, I could have done that. Well, yeah, you could have done, but you didn't.
Really didn't.
Yeah, and it's the same sort of thing. Anyone could say, oh, just keep playing this, but people didn't on the whole. And it's just the combination of those two things. Now, look, they can obviously come up with the goods on their own. They've been doing it now for 30 years or so, and a lot of it is exquisite. But for me, it's a bit like Lennon-McCartney. I'm never going to shy away from Beatles analogies because I'm very Beatles positive. They did it on their own, but it was never quite what it was in the Beatles. And I think it's a similar sort of thing. They needed each other's. They needed to sometimes even. I know it feels like they're working together so much because it comes out so well, but it's almost a little bit like they're working against each other's instincts to do something they wouldn't have otherwise done on their own. That makes a whole which is better than the individual parts.
I think also in terms of the live thing, and I found this when I was listening to one of the recordings, which we're going to talk about a bit later, is that the actual foil between them is it works perfectly because Pete provides this kind of platform which Jason can just kind of completely run amok on, and you can hear Jason going all over the place. Pete is just providing this unbelievably mile-wide guitar, which just takes up all the rest of the space. There's no space left which he's not occupied, and it just gives Jason the opportunity to kind of tear around and do all kinds of carnage. I mean, this is the kind of the 1988 period, so they were still kind of heavyish then in terms of some of the sort of recordings. It's interesting what you said about how on record the there's a great deal of contrast. They bring out a record, Playing with Fire, which only really has a couple of noisy tracks on it, and then they go out and tour, and all they really play is noise. You know, they weren't playing the quiet stuff when they were touring, which I think took a lot of people by surprise.
Yeah.
I was also going to say about the gigs in terms of people around that time. There were a lot of bands that people would go and see to kind of lose their minds to. People like the Butthole Surfers were playing. Well, I saw them a couple of times. I mean, some of them, they were very extreme, those gigs, and they really just blew your brains out. And all the Spacemen 3 gigs I went to, there would be people lying down around the edge of the place. I mean, a lot of these people were pretty out of it, but it just seemed to be that's what they come there to do. That they knew the kind of experience they were going to get. They were going to get an hour of very loud, very hypnotic noise, and so they did whatever they had to do, and then lay on the floor and just absorbed it. But that's unique. I've never seen anything like that before. At the early Spiritualized gigs, a lot of people sat down, which was always rather odd. And I remember that as they started to gain a bit more popularity and people were standing up, all the old Spiritualized fans would be shouting at these people, sit down, please, just because that's what they were used to doing. It's very odd, but yeah, that's something which I do remember is all these kind of corpses around the place at those Spacemen gigs.
That thing you were saying about the live sound that Pete Campbell would give that Jason could play around. I mean, that's just so core to it. Probably my single favorite actual Spacemen 3 recordings, not even one that's been done for a proper album. It's from a practice session, and it was released on the semi-official, not really official at all, compilation album Losing Touch with Your Mind. There's a rehearsal take of Walking with Jesus from on there. And it's just extraordinary. But all Pete Campbell does is just the one note. But it takes up so much of the space, and it gives everyone else a chance to go. And it's just instantly thrilling as well. There's so many of the songs that almost as soon as they start, there's something so captivating about them. And from my point of view as well, the thing I like about Spacemen 3, which hasn't always been replicated in everyone's subsequent work, this sounds like a down point, but it's really not meant to be. It's the fact that when you've heard, say, the first 30 seconds, you know what it's going to be like. But that's not the problem. I don't want it to develop so much as to just to captivate in the first place. And once it's done that, you know, why would you necessarily want it to end?
Yeah, they find a place, and it's a good place, and so they stay there for a bit. I mean, Suicide's probably the best example of that. It's just they just rotate, the same kind of thing occasionally with little kind of pits and troughs and everything else. But it's just a kind of whirling noise which they just arrive at and just keep on bashing away at.
Well, one thing that we wanted to do in every episode was to pick a favorite song. Or not necessarily a favorite song, just any song, and have a chat about it. But we thought we'd start off with the favorite ones. And so when Mark and I were emailing beforehand, my original idea was, we'll choose one each. And I chose one. I said, how about this? And then completely independently, because I don't remember this being something that we'd ever talked about before, Mark came back and said, that's the one I was going to choose. So we appear to have the same favourite Spacemen 3 song. And you've already talked a little bit about this, Mark, but
I have.
Back to you. What are we on about?
Well, as I said, the amazing emergence of Feel So Good from the chaos of Roller Coaster is still a moment that I remember when I first heard it back then. And it's also, as many people will know, it's the early Spacemen 3 song that both Jason and Pete sing vocals on together. And I'd never really thought of Spacemen 3 as a sort of call and response band, but it's almost like that. The way that those vocals work, and the way that it hit me back then is that I obviously knew that there was a certain amount of drugs involved with that band, but it was the music that was far more interesting than that. But this song seemed to be just talking about that kind of juxtaposition of being kind of so high that everything feels so completely wonderful, but at the same time they keep adding this lyric about not going to die, and you know, the greatest highs come with the greatest falls, and potentially that they're so high that they might die, and they keep kind of reminding themselves of that. I mean, there's not a great deal of lyrics in that, but it does focus on that. But there's something about Pete's sort of husky vocals and Jason's rather fragile vocal take on that I mean, I rather wish there'd been more songs that they both appeared on, but it was that which nailed it for me, and that's what I kept going back to, even if I sometimes just played the last minute of Roller Coaster just to get myself in that mind frame where I knew that this kind of moment of glory was soon to come out. And then eventually I got into Roller Coaster as well and everything else, but for some reason that song has always kind of stood out. I also think it's worth mentioning the Spacemen 3's ability with track sequencing. If you take an album like Perfect Prescription, the second side of that, where they put Feel So Good, followed by the Mangled Monster, things that would be the same, and then the most blissed out hippie track in Come Down Easy. It's just incredible. You go from one mood to another, beautifully timed. And then they of course finish with Call the Doctor, which I don't know, there's something about most of Spacemen 3's albums, even recurring as well, where they split things up, but they got the track sequencing just right. And I think on Perfect Prescription, Feel So Good was perfectly timed, just as it was on the EP with Walking with Jesus, where it comes out of the end of Roller Coaster. So it's just that song will always mean something to me, and the fact it's a beautiful song anyway obviously helps.
I'm sure that we're going to have lots more to say about Perfect Prescription in the future. We won't be able to help ourselves even if we wanted to. But I think it's interesting. The version of Feel So Good on Perfect Prescription is obviously much better recorded than the original B-side version. It's got horns, which makes it sound really good as well. It's well recorded. But it doesn't quite cut it for me in the same way that original B-side does.
I would agree.
Okay, it's much more primitive. You can almost hear the sort of ambience in the studio because it's almost like it hasn't been properly soundproofed, and it's all a little bit crackly, and the vocals haven't been completely warmed up for, and that sort of thing. I think it's going back to what you were saying about the core appeal. And yeah, much as I said at the beginning, we don't want to bash on about drugs, but that's obviously pretty central to this one. It really does feel like that moment where everything's just worked out just right. And that's what they're getting down. And I suppose it sounds a little more like that might have just really happened on the B-side than on the Perfect Prescription version, which perhaps sounds a little bit more too polished in that respect. But yes, that's the wonder. Even down the strumming near the beginning, there's a little bit where Jason pauses and then gets back into it, almost like he lost his fingering for a moment. But it just adds to it. It's just, keep going. You know, I know things are quite relaxed at the moment. Keep it going. But what you said also about the dual meaning of it, that didn't hit me until a bit later, because at first I just loved it for what it was, and like you say, of course, the dual lead vocal lines. I mean, I think there is a song or two where there's backing vocals from one of the others on the others' songs, but nothing which has them both up front and like this does. And it was, for me, it was just that, everything's kicked in, as the title suggests. That's what the song's about. But it was when the US reissue of Taking Drugs on Bump came out that had Chris Barris's liner notes, where it would say a few words about each piece. And I distinctly remember it was such a moment that struck me. I remember it so clearly. I bought the CD from a nice little shop in Brighton. I'm very lucky living in this area. We had quite a lot of lovely record shops around that time, and they seemed to know that there were Spacemen fans in the area, so we'd always get these things quite quickly. And then afterwards, walking around town, and my wife and I had gone into a little shop, and she was looking for, I can't remember what, earrings or scarves or something. It was a nice little alternative boutique there, and I was standing at the side reading the liner notes, and I got this bit where it's about Phil, and suddenly it said about the lyrics to the "I Ain't Gonna Die Today," when one of the spacemen having overindulged and really was in trouble, basically. And I just remember feeling literally shaken, thinking, fuck, yes, that is what it's about as well, isn't it? And as you say, therefore, it's that line between the serenity and the danger, which really is fundamental to a lot of what they did. But there it all is in this one track.
But they convey it so well, I think, in that.
Yeah.
I think also the fact that I mentioned Jason's fragile vocal, but Pete sounds like he's really close to the microphone. And there's a couple of lines where the kind of sound of his voice kind of really takes over the music. It's like, it feels so good. Like that's just really getting the feeling across.
Well, there you go. That's our slightly inarticulate attempt to try and say what it was that we both appeals to us both so much about that song. The original B-side of Walking with Jesus still has a very big chance for not only being my favorite song, but also favorite recording. I mean, sometimes there are songs which are very special ones, but they might not be realized in the best ways. But that first one, it's everything we said about it, the sort of fragility and not being a perfect technical recording, but the atmosphere is just right. I do think, as I said earlier, that recently that 1987 Walking with Jesus rehearsal might have just pipped it for me, but not necessarily as a song, although that is, of course, another really strong one, and one that hopefully we'll talk about sometime soon. Well, we've been priming ourselves for today by going back and listening to a live recording, because something else I think we'd like to try and do every time is pick a live recording and have a chat about it. Probably something that you're going to be stuck with me a bit more than Mark, because I just can't seem to reach the end of my patience for listening to the same songs played again and again in increasingly poor recordings. They're just great to listen to. But we picked one that's very special to both of us. And unlike quite a lot of Spacemen 3 recordings, the quality is also extremely good. So which recording are we going to talk about today, Mark?
We're going to talk about the Rose Club in Cologne, which is is it the 11th of January, 88, something like that.
It is the first date on that fairly long European tour.
Yeah, I was going to say my first Spaceman gig was at the very, very end of that when they came back to the UK.
That's right. Yes.
Just as Pete and Roscoe were departing the band.
Yeah. So this was the first date on that European tour, and something that hadn't really occurred to me until I was reading an interview from the time, that I think Pete Camber said, it will always be Pete Camber. He did, you could digest all of the lines that any of the other members of the band said in any of the interviews at the time, down to a couple of paragraphs. It's always going to be him that said it. But he said something like, we're going on tour soon, and I never really clicked. He said we'd not been on tour before, and sort of right, really. They played a lot of gigs, but they was very rarely, up to this point, one after the other. There was a huge amount of a couple here and a couple there and whatever. So this was the first big excursion. Okay, they'd done 6 dates in Europe about a year earlier, and lots of gigs around the UK, but they were usually just, let's go back to London and do a gig at the Clarendon and various, and Manchester was quite a popular place, and of course lots of other Midlands ones. But this was the first big long tour, and it was demanding, and it was a bit of an endurance test for many people. But
they must have set it all up themselves. The idea of these guys in their early 20s booking these dates across Europe and doing it, achieving it.
I'm going to really reveal the depths of my sadness here. I haven't told you this previously, Mark. I recently got a blank map of Europe and plotted all the venues to work out what the logistics were like in terms of how they would have had to travel around. This one's not actually as bad as the 89 one, which is incredible when the distances they had to travel between some days occasionally. But yeah, it obviously was a bit of an endurance test, but this was the first gig, so hopefully everyone's still fresh and primed. Now, there was a bit of background to it, because it was only when the band arrived at the venue that most of them became aware that the promoter of the tour had promoted it as the Sonic Boom Tour. So instantly there's a little bit of feeling of, isn't this all a little bit based around one of us? Now, Pete Kemper claims not to have known about this in advance, and maybe that's true. Although it is worth saying that the promoter of the tour had a company called Boom Productions. So it might have just seen a way to promote themselves as much as linking it into the band. Anyway, the way this has been described is that everyone, basically Jason in particular, shrugged it off. Let's just play a good gig. and it is an extraordinary gig, I think, to be honest. I mean, what do you think some of your highlights are?
Uh, I- Even from the way it starts, when Pete comes on and he says, I think it was very crowded at the venue, and he says, it's just you and me here
Yeah.
tonight. And this rather cynical tone rather sets the tone for everything. There's several great moments. I love the fact that the whole thing is bookended by two renditions of Come Together. Both, they're rather different from each other, but it's almost like by the time they get to the encore, they've only really just got warmed up, because the encores are just on another level on this gig.
Yeah.
And the closing version of Come Together is the best version of Come Together that I've heard. It's so aggressive and it's so intense. But there's a lot of great moments between that. The version of Roller Coaster, I think, kind of really epitomizes the Spaceman 3 sound when it kind of starts to take off. And you can hear Pete and Jason like two perfect pieces of jigsaw, that this partnership that they had of Jason taking the lead and Pete just occupying everything else that Jason's not occupying. It's just remarkable.
It's a bit of an unusual gig in some respects, because when they do Little Dollars, their first encore, which is really powerful version, Pete says in the introduction, we haven't played Little Doll for quite a while. And
you do hear somebody shout it out.
Yeah.
So it's like, we'll do a request.
If it is a request, they turn on a dime and do it pretty much immediately.
It's breathtaking.
It is a great version, but I mean, I know there's a huge number of gigs that we don't have recordings for, so we don't really know what's happened in the meantime. But the last time I can find that they played it before that night was back in March '87. So it's about 10 months, as far as I can make out, since they played it, which definitely fits in with what he says about not having played it for a while. And the OD Catastrophe that follows it, directly follows it, they link them together, is stunning as well. That there's, when people think of Spaceman 3 as a live band, I think there's become a tendency to think of the '89 version as the definitive live experience, and I think that's largely down to the technical skill of Will and Johnny, who are the most amazing rhythm section. And there's no doubt about it, they probably are the most technically proficient people who were ever in the band. And listening to those recordings is quite something. I'm not trying to, the next sentence is not intended to do those guys down, because they are, what an incredible run of gigs they had in '89. But I think the consequence of them being quite so technically proficient is that people tend to overlook the Pete Bain Roscoe backup, which isn't as technically proficient. I'm not going to pretend that they're virtuosos, but they've got the feeling, just in the same way that Pete Kember's got the feeling. And actually, some of the bass playing on this is pretty amazing.
Yeah, it's excellent. The encore of Come Together, I think that Pete Bain and Roscoe are just on fire for that.
Yeah. So for anyone who might have fixated a little bit on the latter incarnation, well, well done. There's loads to enjoy there, but check this one out. If you want to check this one out, then the whole gig is on YouTube, and I'll put a link next to wherever you found this podcast that you can do, or just search for it yourself. And it's a great recording as well. I gather it's from the master tape, or one of the master tapes. I think it's more than one recording of this gig doing the rounds, because of course it did get released on a bootleg called All Fucked Up, but of which I know pretty much nothing. I have no idea who put it out, but obviously just made up the label they put it out on just to do this one thing. It's the sort of thing you used to see in record fairs a lot, when you go in and people would have pressed up lots of their own bootleg things. But unfortunately, whatever recording's been used for that one isn't really very good. It's quite hissy. It hasn't got the bass, and it's if you've only heard it because of that, then you haven't really had a proper representation of what the night was like.
So the YouTube one is the one to hear, I think. Really,
definitely. One thing that I noticed when I was checking it out before we talked about it was that, and this is not unusual throughout all of the times that they played Roller Coaster, especially in the later years, they get so wrapped up in the instrumental repetition as it builds and gets more and more powerful, that I think they forget that they haven't really finished the song, because that song's got 3 verses and they only do one. They only do the first one. That's right. There's no return to it. There's no after your trip, life opens up, or whatever the second verse is as well. It doesn't seem to matter. I mean, it's great that this time. I think you're right about the second version of Come Together being the better one, and it is really powerful. I'm very glad that it's there. In a way, though, I think it's a slight shame. This is the first gig that I'm aware of where there is the same song being played more than once. And although it does work pretty well this night, it's not something I'm a tremendously big fan of. And I mean, this is all academic for me because I've only got recordings to go on. But I think if I had gone to see my favourite band, who've got the most incredible back catalogue, okay, not massive, but there's quite a lot on there. If I were to have Revolution twice, rather than something else I could have had, I might have been felt a little shortchanged.
Is there not a bit just before they play Come Together and Pete says, well, there's a lot of things we could have played tonight, but we could sit around all night talking about those.
Well, indeed, he's quite right. He does acknowledge it, which he never does again. So I wonder if this is the first time they played a track twice and that he felt they needed a little explanation. Because after this, Revolution tended to be the 189. It was quite unusual for it not to be played twice. I think probably it's just an example of them, as you were saying earlier, doing what they wanted to do, in the same way that they looked how they wanted to look and sat down if they wanted to sit down. And if that was a song that they enjoyed playing, probably, let's face it, if Pete enjoyed playing, then they'll play it again. And why not, really? I mean, you've got to accept the whole deal, really. If you sign up to follow Spacemen 3, you've got to sort of do it the way they like to do it, as much as you'd like it to do it.
There's some other quite fun bits of banter, isn't there, with the audience shouting stuff
there
out.
There are indeed.
It's just quite amusing. But
walking with Jesus.
That's right. Jesus isn't with us tonight. Yes, all that sort of stuff. But
why not? Solo gigs.
There's also I mean, going back to the encore, I think that Little Doll from that was the thing that probably stands out for me as the great moment with Ode Catastrophe after it. But it kind of epitomizes the way that the sound they create sounds like it's just going to fall apart, disintegrate, come off the rails, and yet they just keep it going. And it's obviously it's a finely crafted sound that they just knew how to do it. But there are moments during Little Doll where it's wobbling to the point where you think they're not going to be able to carry it, and they just keep it going. I don't quite know how they do it.
I wonder if they talked about that afterwards, because as we've already said, and as Pete says in his introduction, they hadn't played it for a long time before that night. And although we've not got recordings of the whole European tour, there's quite a lot of it, and it never crops up again. So it might be the last time they ever played it.
It's a shame.
Yeah, well, maybe because of that, we were only just able to keep that together. I don't know. Hey guys, if you're out there, let us know if you remember. We're always delighted to hear from you. Well, as I say, you're probably going to be stuck with me with live recordings in the future, so as not to oblige Mark to have to listen to increasingly creaky and crackly old recordings. A flip side to that, Mark has got a great knowledge of bands which will be of interest to Spacemen 3 fans. Not necessarily because they sound like them, sometimes they might do, but bands which have got the same sort of appeal, very much the same sort of audience overlap to them. So, Mark, tell us about someone who you've been thinking about recently.
Well, I think the one that's probably worth mentioning around from around the same time would be Galaxie 500, which I imagine a lot of Spacemen 3 fans will know these guys anyway. Dean Wareham was the guitarist and vocalist originally from New Zealand, but moved to the States and set up the band with the rhythm section Damon and Naomi. Played for a number of years. They released, I think, 3 albums, all of which are worth tracking down. I mean, the music is excellent. Their whole catalogue is fantastic. Another fairly acrimonious split after their 3rd album, which was called This Is Our Music, came out in 1990. But that's probably the album as a Spacemen 3 fan that I would head for. There's one particular song called Summertime, which is, it's not exactly a tribute track, but if you watch any interviews with Galaxie 500 around that time, they name check Spacemen 3 quite a lot. There's no question that there was some influence in Summertime, which is to me an absolutely wonderful song, some form of tribute, but with enough Galaxie 500 in there to keep it interesting for their own fans as well. That whole album is well worth getting. But around that time, there was a point where I don't know whether they would have got on tour together, but Dean was going on about people like Yola Tango, Spacemen 3 as being kind of contemporary bands, which Yola Tango is another band that we could talk about. But I think that Galaxie 500 would certainly be one which I would check out. I only managed to catch them live once. I think I was very fortunate. It was at the Ulu venue, which at that point was my favorite venue in London. It had a really good sound system, nice bar, nice people, just a really good place to go. And that night they actually had Kramer on the mixing desk. The guy who ran the Shibby Disc label was worked with all sorts of people over the years. So you had one of the best engineers on the desk that night, and it was one of those, everything just fell into place, the sound, the music, the set, everything. And before I knew it, they split up, and that was the end of that. But there's certainly a band, as a Spacemen 3 fan, I would definitely go and check out.
It's worth saying that the organisation Sonic Cathedral, who have a big emphasis on shoegazy things, but also very much big Spacemen 3 fans, they put out a fanzine a little while ago, which you can still buy, a bundle of 3 sort of poster fanzines. It's only £6 if you're in the UK. And there's a thing in there where Dean Wareham and Pete Kember chat about that time, the end of Spacemen 3, and what Galaxie 500 were doing at the time. It's only a short piece, but it's well worth getting hold of.
They are, of course, good friends now, Dean and Pete. They work together. Pete's produced some of Dean's music, some of Dean and Britta, this and that. In fact, that's another very durable musician, Dean Wareham. A lot of his music up to this day is still worth checking out. You still feel some of that vibe that he had with Galaxie 500 from over 30 years ago. Well worth a look.
Well, hope you've enjoyed some of the stuff we've chatted about. I mean, we've got ideas for the future. If you've got anything that you want to suggest to us, please let us know. Not quite sure at the moment how regular these will be, but we hope that we'll be back again at some point soon.
When we have enough interesting material to talk about.
Yeah, so. Until then, thanks for coming.
Many thanks. Goodbye.
We've been Spacemen Pod. Good night.